The unexpected romance between his daughter and the gardener forces the millionaire to face his own prejudices. His reaction surprises everyone and sets the stage for dramatic changes. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun cast long shadows across the immaculately maintained gardens of the Whitmore estate in Beverly Hills. Emily Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, coffee cup in hand, watching the new gardener methodically trim the hedges that lined the Olympic-sized pool. David had been working for her father for 3 months now, and she couldn't help but notice how he approached each task with careful precision. The garden had never looked better since David took over. Unlike the previous gardeners who simply went through the motions, David treated each plant with individual attention. Emily noticed how he would adjust his approach based on each plant's specific needs, something she learned from quietly observing him over the weeks. That morning, Emily decided to venture outside. She walked down the marble steps leading to the garden, her footsteps echoing in the quiet morning air. David looked up briefly, acknowledging her presence with a professional nod before returning to his work. Emily settled into one of the cushioned loungers, pretending to read a book while stealing glances at him over the pages. David moved with natural grace despite the physical demands of his work. Sweat glistened on his dark skin as he wrestled with a particularly stubborn branch. Emily found herself admiring the way his muscles flexed beneath his fitted work shirt, then quickly looked away when he caught her watching. The morning progressed with this unspoken dance between them. Emily would look up from her book, their eyes would meet momentarily, and both would quickly look away. The tension built with each passing minute until Emily couldn't stand it anymore. Setting her book aside, she walked to the small refrigerator by the pool house and pulled out 2 bottles of water. "You look like you could use this," she said, approaching David with an extended bottle. Their fingers brushed as he accepted it, sending an unexpected jolt through her hand. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore," David replied, his voice deep and measured. "Please call me Emily," she insisted, noting how his professional demeanor softened slightly at her request. That evening, feeling bold after their morning interaction, Emily approached David as he was finishing up his work. "Would you mind walking with me around the pool? I'd like to discuss some ideas for the garden." David hesitated, glancing at the main house where staff members occasionally passed by the windows. "I wouldn't want to cause any trouble, Miss Emily. It's just a work discussion," Emily assured him, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. As they walked, their conversation moved naturally from plants to personal interests. David spoke about his dreams of owning his own landscaping business someday. Emily shared her passion for photography and her secret desire to open a gallery instead of joining her father's investment firm as expected. Neither of them noticed Jake Martinez, a family friend, watching from the tennis court. He stood frozen, racket in hand, observing their intimate conversation. The way Emily leaned in when David spoke, how their laughter carried across the evening air, the unmistakable chemistry between them. It all painted a picture that would soon become the talk of Beverly Hills. Jake quietly backed away, his mind already racing with the implications of what he'd witnessed. The daughter of Charles Whitmore, one of Beverly Hills' most prominent residents, sharing what appeared to be an intimate moment with the gardener. This wasn't just gossip, it was potentially explosive news in their social circle. As the sun began to set, Emily and David reluctantly parted ways, both aware that something had shifted between them. The professional barrier had cracked, revealing a connection that neither of them had anticipated, but both felt powerfully drawn to explore. Their conversation by the pool marked the beginning of something that would challenge not just their own preconceptions, but those of everyone around them. As David gathered his tools and Emily walked back to the house, neither could have predicted how their simple garden chat would soon ripple through the carefully maintained social fabric of Beverly Hills. News traveled fast in Beverly Hills, especially when it involved the Whitmore family. Jake Martinez sat at his usual table at the Beverly Hills Tennis Club, surrounded by his usual crowd of socialites and business heirs. He couldn't contain the information any longer. "You won't believe what I saw at the Whitmore estate yesterday," Jake said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Emily, Charles's daughter, getting cozy with their gardener by the pool. "Not just talking about plants, if you know what I mean," The reaction was immediate. Marion Stewart nearly choked on her mimosa. Emily Whitmore? Charles would have a stroke. Are you absolutely certain? Saw it with my own eyes, Jake confirmed, enjoying the attention. They were laughing, standing way too close. She was looking at him like, well, not like you'd look at your gardener. Within hours, the story spread through country club lounges, charity committee meetings, and private WhatsApp groups. Each retelling added new details, some true, some embellished. By evening, the story had reached Charles Whitmore's inner circle. Charles was in his home office reviewing quarterly reports when his closest friend, Richard Bennett, called. Charles, old friend, I hate to be the bearer of uncomfortable news, but there's something you should know. People are talking. The color drained from Charles's face as Richard relayed the rumors. He'd noticed Emily spending more time in the garden lately, but had attributed it to her recent interest in photography. Now, pieces were falling into place. Her distracted behavior at dinner, her sudden enthusiasm for garden renovation plans. That evening, Charles waited in his study until he heard Emily return home. Emily, he called out, his voice strained with tension. Could you join me for a moment? Emily entered the study, immediately sensing something was wrong. Charles stood by the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. I've heard some disturbing rumors today, he began, turning to face her. About you and the gardener, David. Emily's heart raced, but she lifted her chin defiantly. His name is David Wilson, Dad, and he's more than just the gardener. Please tell me this is all a misunderstanding, Charles said, sinking into his leather chair. Tell me you haven't been involved with him. I won't lie to you, Emily replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Ikare abud David. He's intelligent, kind, and hardworking. Why should it matter that he's the gardener? Or that he's black? Charles flinched at her directness. Emily, you don't understand the complexities, Dash. No, Dad, I understand perfectly, Emily interrupted. I understand that in 2024, we're still dealing with the same prejudices that should have died out decades ago. I understand that your concern isn't about David as a person, but about what your friends will think. Her words hit Charles like a physical blow. He prided himself on being progressive, on supporting diversity initiatives in his company, on having friends from various backgrounds. But his daughter's relationship with David forced him to confront his own hidden biases. You've always taught me to judge people by their character, Emily continued, softer now. David has shown nothing but excellence in his work and kindness to everyone here. Isn't that what should matter? Charles stood and walked to his office window, looking out at the garden David had transformed. The perfectly manicured lawns, the thoughtfully arranged flower beds, the restored rose garden his late wife had loved, all testified to David's dedication and skill. This won't be easy, Charles said finally, still staring out the window. People will talk. They'll make assumptions. Some doors might close. I know, Emily replied. But maybe it's time some of those doors were broken down. Charles turned to face his daughter, seeing not the little girl he'd raised but a strong, principled woman. His immediate instinct to protect her warred with his respect for her conviction. The society he'd built his life around expected certain things, followed certain rules. But as he looked at Emily's determined expression, he wondered if perhaps it was time for those rules to change. The conversation ended without resolution, leaving both father and daughter with much to consider. As Emily left the study, Charles remained at the window, watching the garden where this unexpected story had begun, wrestling with questions he'd never thought he'd have to face. The next afternoon, Emily met David at Holmby Park, far enough from Beverly Hills' prying eyes to offer some privacy. They chose a secluded bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, where the afternoon shadows provided cover from curious onlookers. My father knows, Emily said without preamble, watching David's expression tighten. Someone saw us by the pool, and the gossip spread faster than I expected. David leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. I should hand in my resignation. I don't want to cause problems for you or your family. No, Emily said firmly, placing her hand over his. Running away solves nothing. Besides, my father, he didn't react as badly as I feared. He's struggling with it, but I saw something in his eyes, like he's fighting with himself about how to feel. David shifted uncomfortably on the bench. Emily, we need to be realistic. I've seen how this plays out before. The wealthy family tolerates the relationship at first, but when the social pressure builds, when business partners start making comments, when friends start declining invitations, that's when things get ugly. Is that what your grandmother's worried about? Emily asked gently, remembering how David had mentioned her concerns. David nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. Big Mama's seen a lot in her 80 years. She grew up in Birmingham during the civil rights movement. When I told her about us, she just shook her head and said, "Baby, some people ain't ready for their worlds to change." Emily squeezed his hand tighter. "Then we'll help them get ready. I'm not giving up on us, because some people are stuck in the past." My grandmother also said something else, David continued, turning to face Emily directly. She said if this is real, if we're serious about each other, we need to be prepared for a long fight. Not just against others, but against our own doubts too. As they talked, neither noticed Charles Whitmore's black Mercedes parked discreetly across the park. He sat behind the tinted windows, observing his daughter and the man who had unexpectedly become such a significant part of their lives. Charles watched as David gently wiped away a tear from Emily's cheek, saw how his daughter leaned into the touch. He noticed how David maintained a respectful distance in public while still showing genuine care. Most importantly, he saw Emily smile, a smile he hadn't seen since before her mother passed away. The scene before him challenged everything Charles thought he knew about appropriate relationships in their social circle. David wasn't anything like the young men Emily had dated before, the sons of business partners, Harvard graduates with trust funds and family connections. Instead, he carried himself with quiet dignity and genuine warmth. As the afternoon progressed, Charles observed their interaction with growing complexity of emotion. He recognized the same gentle protectiveness in David that he had once felt toward Emily's mother. The way David listened intently when Emily spoke, how he made her laugh, how he seemed to anticipate her needs, it all spoke to a depth of character that transcended social status. "I promise you," Emily's voice carried faintly to where Charles sat, "we'll figure this out together. My father may surprise us. He's more adaptable than people think." Charles sank lower in his seat, struck by his daughter's faith in him. The weight of his position in society, his responsibilities, his friends' expectations, all of it seemed suddenly less important than his daughter's happiness. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Charles started his car and drove away, his mind heavy with thoughts. He had come to spy, to gather information, to perhaps find a reason to end this inappropriate relationship. Instead, he left with uncomfortable questions about his own prejudices and the realization that his daughter had found something real and precious, regardless of society's expectations. The Whitmore Mansion's formal dining room, typically reserved for business dinners and charity galas, felt unusually tense that evening. Charles had surprised everyone by inviting David to dinner, along with several family friends, a decision that sent shockwaves through their social circle. The table was set with the finest Wedgwood china, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier above. David arrived precisely on time, dressed in a well-fitted navy suit that Emily had never seen before. He carried himself with dignity, though Emily could see the slight tension in his shoulders as their regular dinner guests, the Bennetts and the Harises, gave him measured looks. "David," Charles greeted him with forced casualness, "thank you for joining us this evening. Please take a seat next to Emily." The strategic seating arrangement didn't go unnoticed. Charles had placed David between Emily and himself, perhaps as a subtle show of support. Margaret Harris, who had known Emily since childhood, barely concealed her disapproval. "So, David," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured politeness, "how long have you been gardening?" "I've been in landscaping for 10 years, David replied evenly. "I studied horticultural science at UC Davis and worked my way up through several prestigious firms before starting my own business." Richard Bennett nearly choked on his wine. "Your own business? How enterprising." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Emily felt her face flush with anger. But before she could respond, David continued smoothly, "Yes, we specialize in sustainable landscape design for drought-resistant gardens. In fact, The changes I've implemented here at the Whitmore estate have reduced water consumption by 40% while maintaining aesthetic appeal. Charles, who had been quietly observing, suddenly straightened in his chair. The water bill savings have been remarkable, he confirmed, surprising everyone with his support. David's expertise has transformed our grounds. The first course arrived, a delicate mushroom soup, but the tension remained palpable. Linda Bennett, unable to contain herself, turned to Emily. "Darling, whatever happened to that lovely Princeton boy you were seeing?" Thomas Winchester raison. James Winchester was a self-absorbed bore who couldn't tell a rose from a dandelion, Emily replied sharply. And he certainly never cared about environmental impact or sustainable practices. Emily, Charles warned, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice. The conversation continued to navigate treacherous waters throughout the main course. Richard Bennett made a pointed comment about maintaining certain standards in Beverly Hills, while Margaret Harris reminisced about the good old days when everyone knew their place. Finally, during dessert, Richard Bennett crossed a line. "I mean, really, CH. Alls," he said, wine loosening his tongue. "Have you considered what this situation might do to your business relationships? People talk, you know. They might not be as understanding as we are." The room fell silent. Emily gripped her dessert fork so tightly her knuckles turned white. But before she could speak, Charles set down his glass with deliberate care. "Understanding?" Charles's voice was quiet but firm. "What exactly are we understanding about, Richard? That my daughter has found someone intelligent, educated, and hardworking? Someone who has built his own successful business from the ground up, just as I did? Someone who treats her with respect and genuine care?" The silence deepened. Margaret Harris's mouth hung open slightly. "Or perhaps," Charles continued, his voice gaining strength, "we should understand that it's 2024, and yet some of us are still clinging to prejudices that should have died out long ago. David has shown more class and dignity tonight than anyone who's questioned his presence here." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes as her father continued. "If any of my business relationships depend on discriminating against good people based on their race or profession, then perhaps those aren't relationships worth maintaining." The rest of the dessert was eaten in stunned silence. As the guests made their awkward goodbyes, David stood tall, thanking Charles for his hospitality with the same grace he'd shown all evening. After everyone left, Charles, Emily, and David remained in the dining room, the evening's tension slowly dissipating. Something had shifted, not just in Charles's public stance, but in the dynamic between all three of them. The dinner had been a test, and while it revealed the challenges they still faced, it also showed they wouldn't face them alone. In the wake of the dramatic dinner party, Charles threw himself into planning an unprecedented event, a community gathering focused on diversity and inclusion in Beverly Hills. He reserved the Beverly Hills Hotel's Crystal Ballroom, a venue typically used for society weddings and charity galas, but this time it would serve a different purpose. The event's planning revealed deep-seated tensions within their social circle. Several longtime family friends declined their invitations with thinly veiled excuses. Others, surprisingly, stepped forward with enthusiasm, including some who had previously remained silent on such matters. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked her father one evening as they reviewed the guest list. "The Stevensons have canceled their annual donation to your foundation, and the Richardsons are threatening to pull their investments." Charles looked up from his desk, his expression resolute. "For years, I've told myself that change happens gradually, that pushing too hard only makes people resist more. But watching you and David, I realize I've been using that as an excuse for complacency." David had been named as a special guest speaker, scheduled to present his vision for sustainable urban landscaping and community development. The announcement had caused quite a stir, with some dismissing it as Charles's attempt to legitimize his daughter's relationship, while others praised the progressive move. Meanwhile, Laura Matthews, Emily's best friend since childhood, was struggling with her own reactions to recent events. She requested a private lunch with Emily at their favorite cafe on Rodeo Drive. "I need to be honest with you," Laura said, stirring her untouched salad. "When I first heard about you and David, I had reservations. Not because of his race," she added quickly, "or at least I didn't think so. But I've been doing some soul-searching, Emily listened as Laura continued. My parents divorced because my father had an affair with his secretary. Everyone said it was inappropriate, that he'd crossed social boundaries. I think I projected those fears onto your situation with David. But I was wrong. What you have is completely different. How so? Emily asked softly. Your relationship with David isn't about rebellion or convenience. It's genuine. And watching you stand up for your love, watching your father change his views, it's made me question my own prejudices about class and status. As the event drew closer, Emily and David found themselves increasingly in the public eye. Local newspapers caught wind of the story, and soon articles appeared speculating about the relationship between the Whitmore heiress and the landscaper who had captured her heart. Some coverage was sensational and negative, portraying David as an opportunist or Emily as a naive socialite. Other articles were more thoughtful, examining how their relationship challenged Beverly Hills' social hierarchy. David handled the attention with characteristic grace, while Emily fought back against misconceptions with passionate clarity. The pressure began to weigh on David. One evening, in the privacy of the Whitmore garden where their story began, he confessed his concerns to Emily. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being selfish, letting you face all this backlash. Your life was simpler before me. Emily took his hands in hers. Simpler doesn't mean better. Everything meaningful in life comes with challenges. Besides, she smiled, who wants a simple love story? The event was 3 days away when the first threatening letters arrived. Anonymous notes suggesting David know his place and warning the Whitmores about maintaining standards. Charles immediately hired additional security, refusing to be intimidated. The situation crystallized something for both Emily and David. Their relationship had become more than just a personal love story. Whether they'd intended it or not, they'd become symbols of change in a community that desperately needed it, even if some weren't ready to admit it. As final preparations for the event were made, tension in Beverly Hills reached a fever pitch. The guest list had grown beyond their usual social circle to include community leaders, civil rights activists, and even some celebrities who'd heard about the event and wanted to show support. No one could have predicted how the evening would unfold, or how a mysterious woman's arrival would change everything they thought they knew about the Whitmore family history. The evening of the event arrived with an electric atmosphere at the Beverly Hills Hotel. The Crystal Ballroom had been transformed, with elegant floral arrangements designed by David himself, a subtle reminder of his professional expertise. Security personnel discreetly positioned themselves throughout the venue, a necessary precaution given the recent threats. The guest list had divided the community into clear factions. On one side, longtime Beverly Hills residents like the Bennetts and Harises arrived with barely concealed disapproval, clustering together in judgmental groups. On the other, a mix of progressive socialites, young professionals, and community activists created a more diverse crowd than the ballroom had ever seen. Emily stood at the entrance alongside her father, greeting guests with practiced poise. She wore a stunning emerald green gown, while David, arriving separately to avoid early controversy, chose a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Their eyes met across the room, sharing a moment of silent understanding about what was at stake. Maybe this was a mistake, David whispered to Emily when they finally had a moment alone. I can feel the hostility from some of your father's friends. This could damage his reputation permanently. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on David's shoulders. He'd grown up learning to navigate predominantly white spaces with careful dignity, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Emily's future, Charles's standing in the community, and the broader implications for social change in Beverly Hills. We can't back down now, Emily insists. Ted squeezing his hand. Look around. Yes, there are people here who oppose us, but there are also so many who support us. We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. The evening's program began with Charles taking the stage. He started his speech about community unity and the importance of challenging long-held prejudices. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by occasional murmurs of agreement or dissent. Just as David was preparing to take the stage for his presentation, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A woman in her early 60s, elegantly dressed, but unfamiliar to most of the crowd, walked purposefully into the ballroom. Her presence commanded attention, and something about her bearing suggested she wasn't just another guest. "Hello, Charles," she called out, her voice carrying across the room. "It's been a long time." Charles froze mid-sentence, his face draining of color as he recognized her. Emily felt David's hand tighten around hers as they watched the scene unfold. The woman moved closer to the stage, each step deliberate. "I've been following your family's story in the papers," she continued, her voice laden with meaning. "I found it quite ironic." Security moved to intercept her, but Charles waved them off. The entire room held its breath, sensing they were witnessing something momentous. "I thought it was time," the woman announced, looking around the room, that everyone knew the truth about the Whitmore family's own history with forbidden love. Emily felt her father's distress from across the room. Whatever this woman knew, it clearly had the power to shake their world further. But as she looked at David, at her father, at the divided crowd of guests, she realized that perhaps this revelation, whatever it was necessary. Another layer of truth that needed to come to light. David stepped forward, his natural instinct to protect Emily warring with his understanding that this moment might be crucial for everyone involved. "Whatever she has to say," he whispered to Emily, "we'll face it together." The room crackled with tension as the woman prepared to speak again. Phones were quietly raised to record what was happening. Society matrons whispered behind their hands. And Charles Whitmore, one of Beverly Hills' most powerful men, stood frozen on stage, facing what appeared to be a ghost from his past. The mysterious woman's presence transformed the elegant event into something that felt more like a dramatic confrontation. She stood in the center of the ballroom, commanding attention with an air of someone who had waited years for this moment. "My name is Eleanor Wright," she announced, her voice steady and clear. "And 30 years ago, Charles Whitmore and I were in love. But unlike your daughter, Charles," she looked directly at Emily, "you didn't have the courage to stand up to your family." The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. Eleanor Wright was black, and suddenly the context of her statement became clear to everyone present. Charles gripped the podium, his knuckles white. "I worked as a legal intern at Whitmore Industries," Eleanor continued, addressing the stunned audience. "Charles and I fell in love, but when his father discovered our relationship, he threatened to disinherit Charles and dismantle the company, affecting hundreds of employees' livelihoods." Emily felt David's supportive arm around her waist as she watched her father's composure crumble. The mighty Charles Whitmore, who had recently become their fierce defender, had his own painful history with prejudice and forbidden love. "Charles chose the company," Eleanor said, her voice carrying years of pain. "He married Emily's mother, a lovely woman, I should add, and I was transferred to a different firm with excellent recommendations and a generous severance package. All very civilized, very quiet." The whispers in the room grew louder. Some guests began to edge toward the exits, while others moved closer, drawn to the unfolding drama. Charles finally found his voice. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you're right. I was a coward. I chose security and family expectations over love. It's been my deepest regret, and watching Emily and David seeing their courage, it forced me to confront my own past failures." David stepped forward, still holding Emily's hand. "Mrs. Wright," he said, his deep voice carrying across the now silent room, "why come forward now?" Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "Because history is repeating itself, but with a crucial difference. Charles is now in his father's position, but he's making a different choice. I needed to see it for myself." Emily broke away from David and approached Eleanor. "Did you ever marry?" she asked softly. "Yes," Eleanor replied with a sad smile. "To a wonderful man who shared my passion for civil rights law. We had a good life. But first loves, they leave their mark." Charles descended from the stage and walked slowly toward Eleanor. The room watched, breathless, as these former lovers faced each other after 3 decades. "I am so sorry," Charles said, his voice breaking. "Not just for choosing my father's approval over our love, but for living with that choice in silence for so long." Watching Emily and David, seeing their strength, it made me realize how much courage I lacked back then. Eleanor's composed facade cracked slightly. I didn't come here for revenge, Charles. I came because when I saw the news about Emily and David, about you defending them, I needed to know if you had really changed or if this was just a public show of support. The tension in the room was palpable as Charles responded. I've changed because I had to face my own hypocrisy. When Emily first told me about David, my initial reaction was exactly like my father's had been. It terrified me to see myself becoming what I had once resented. David moved to stand beside Emily, facing this unexpected revelation of family history together. The crowd around them had grown silent, witnessing a moment of raw truth that transcended the usual social pleasantries of Beverly Hills gatherings. The revelation of Charles and Eleanor's past relationship rippled through the ballroom, transforming the atmosphere from one of social tension to profound reflection. Several of the older guests, who had been most vocal in their opposition to Emily and David's relationship, now sat in uncomfortable silence, perhaps seeing their own past choices reflected in Charles's story. Richard Bennett, who had been so condescending at the dinner party, approached Charles with a chastened expression. Charles, I had no idea. All these years we've been friends and I never knew. How could you know, Richard? Charles replied, his voice steady but tired. We all kept our secrets, maintained our images. But at what cost? Eleanor's presence had achieved what months of debate couldn't. It had made the abstract personal. The older generation of Beverly Hills society could no longer pretend that these issues were new or foreign to their world. They had been there all along, buried beneath layers of propriety and tradition. Emily, still processing the revelation about her father's past, felt a sudden surge of determination. She asked for the microphone, and the room fell silent as she took center stage. I've heard so many people say that David and I are being naive, she began, her voice clear and strong, that we don't understand the complexities of society, the importance of tradition. But looking around this room tonight, I see that what we're doing isn't new at all. The only difference is that we're refusing to hide. She looked directly at Eleanor, then at her father. 30 years ago, two people in love were forced apart because society wasn't ready. Their happiness was sacrificed on the altar of propriety and tradition. Well, I'm standing here today to say that I won't let that happen to Guy. Not to me and David, not to anyone else. The impact of her words was visible on the faces of the guests. Marion Stewart, who had been one of the most vocal critics, dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Her husband, Thomas, stared into his champagne glass, perhaps remembering his own youth and the choices he'd made. David joined Emily on stage, taking her hand in a gesture that now carried even more significance. I grew up hearing stories from my grandmother about love across racial lines that had to be hidden, denied, or abandoned, he said. Each story was treated like a tragedy, an inevitable sacrifice to the times. But standing here tonight, I realized those weren't just stories. They were warnings. Warnings about what happens when we let fear overcome love. Charles watched from below, Eleanor standing nearby, as the younger generation seized this moment to reshape the narrative. The crowd began to shift, with former opponents approaching David and Emily to offer quiet words of support or simply apologetic nods. Margaret Harris, who had been particularly cruel in her gossip, made her way to Eleanor. I was there, she said quietly. Back then, I suspected something, but I chose to look the other way. I've done that too many times in my life. The evening had transformed from a carefully orchestrated social event into something more raw and honest. People who had arrived ready to judge were now engaged in genuine conversations about their own experiences with prejudice and regret. As the night progressed, it became clear that the revelation of Charles and Eleanor's past had cracked the veneer of Beverly Hills society. The carefully maintained facade of progressive values hiding deeper prejudices could no longer hold. Real change, it seemed, would finally have its moment. The evening began winding down as the full weight of revelation settled over the crowd. What had started as a tense social event had evolved into something more meaningful, a moment of collective reflection, and perhaps the beginning of real change in Beverly Hills society. Small groups formed throughout the ballroom, engaged in hushed but earnest conversations. The usual social barriers seemed to have dissolved, if only temporarily, as guests shared their own stories of love, prejudice, and regret. The carefully maintained social hierarchy of Beverly Hills was showing its first real cracks. Several guests approached David, not with the condescension of before, but with genuine apologies. An elderly woman, her hands trembling slightly, took his hands in hers. "My daughter married outside our faith 20 years ago," she confessed. "I didn't attend the wedding. I've regretted it every day since." Charles, who had maintained his composure through the evening's drama, finally prepared to make his closing remarks. The room hushed as he returned to the podium, Eleanor still present in the audience, a living reminder of his past. "When I planned this event," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades, "I thought I was doing it for Emily and David. I thought I was being progressive, showing support for my daughter's choices. But standing here now, I realize this event wasn't just about them. It was about all of us, about the choices we've made and the ones we still have to make." He paused, gathering his thoughts. 30 years ago, I chose what I thought was safety over love. I chose social acceptance over personal happiness. I told myself it was the responsible thing to do, the proper thing. Tonight, watching my daughter stand firm in her love for David, I see the courage I should have had. Emily and David stood together near the stage, their hands clasped tightly. The sight of them, young, in love, and unafraid, seemed to touch something deep in the assembled crowd. "We talk about progress," Charles continued, "about how times have changed. But change doesn't just happen. It requires courage, the courage to face our prejudices, to challenge our assumptions, to admit our mistakes. Tonight, thanks to Eleanor's bravery in coming forward, we've been forced to confront our own histories, our own biases." Eleanor stepped forward then, her dignity intact despite the emotional revelations of the evening. "The past cannot be changed," she said, addressing the room. "But the future is still in our hands. What matters now is what we choose to do with these truths." As guests began to leave, there was none of the usual rush to be the first to share gossip or pass judgment. Instead, people lingered, exchanging contact information, making plans to continue conversations that had barely begun. The evening had stripped away pretenses, leaving something raw but real in their place. The event officially ended with a moment that no one present would soon forget. David, who had maintained his composure throughout the emotional evening, addressed the remaining guests. "Thank you," he said simply, "for being willing to listen, to learn, to change. That's all anyone can ask for." As the last guest departed, Emily, David, Charles, and Eleanor remained in the ballroom, bound together by revelations that had changed all their lives. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like real change was possible in their corner of Beverly Hills. 3 days after the transformative event at the Beverly Hills Hotel, David received an urgent call while working in the Whitmore Garden. His grandmother's neighbor informed him that Big Mama had been rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center after experiencing chest pains. David dropped his tools immediately, his hands shaking as he dialed Emily. Within minutes, both Emily and Charles insisted on accompanying him to the hospital. The three of them arrived to find Big Mama in the cardiac unit, conscious but weak. "David, baby," she called out weakly when she saw him. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Charles Whitmore behind her grandson. Well, Charles Whitmore himself. "Never thought I'd see the day." Charles stepped forward, an odd expression crossing his face as he looked at David's grandmother. Recognition slowly dawned in his eyes. "Martha? Martha Johnson?" The room fell silent. David looked between his grandmother and Charles, confusion evident on his face. Emily gripped the back of a nearby chair, sensing another revelation approaching. "Big Mama, Martha Johnson," smiled weakly. "I wondered if you'd remember me, Charles. It's been, 40 years? I was Eleanor's best friend back then. I watched your whole story unfold." "More than that," Charles said softly. "You were the one who helped us meet in secret. You worked in my father's house as the housekeeper." David sat heavily in the chair beside his grandmother's bed. "Big Mama, what's going on?" Martha reached for her grandson's hand. "I never told you everything about my past, baby. I worked for the Whitmore family for 15 years. I was there when Charles and Eleanor fell in love. I saw how Charles's father destroyed their happiness. She paused, breathing deeply before continuing. When Eleanor left, I couldn't stay. I quit and followed her to a new life. We supported each other, became family. She was there when your mother was born, David. She's your godmother. Emily gasped softly. The connections between their families ran deeper than anyone had imagined. All these years, David said, his voice thick with emotion, you knew about the Whitmores, about Eleanor? Why didn't you say anything when I told you about Emily? Martha squeezed his hand. Because some stories need to unfold in their own time, baby. When you told me about falling in love with Emily Whitmore, I saw it as life giving us all a second chance. I wanted to see if Charles had learned from his mistakes, if he'd grown into a better man than his father. Charles moved closer to the hospital bed. Martha, I had no idea. All these years you've been watching over our family. Lies, waiting for this moment. Life has a way of coming full circle, Martha replied. When I saw you defending David and Emily at that event, standing up to the same prejudices your father once represented, I knew my silence had served its purpose. But then this old heart of mine couldn't take the excitement. The monitor beside her bed beeped steadily as she continued. Eleanor and I never lost touch. She's been like a sister to me all these years. David grew up hearing stories about her life, her work, her courage, without ever knowing her connection to the Whitmores. Emily looked at David, seeing him process this information. So our families have been connected all along, she said softly. Through love, through pain, through silence, and now through us. Martha nodded. Sometimes love skips a generation before it finds its way home. You two are finishing what Charles and Eleanor couldn't. Not because they didn't love each other enough, but because the world wasn't ready then. It's ready now. The revelation brought their story full circle. The prejudices that had torn Charles and Eleanor apart had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would bring their families back together through David and Emily. The gardens where David and Emily fell in love were the same gardens where Martha had once helped Charles and Eleanor meet in secret. As they sat together in that hospital room, the past and present intertwined, they realized that their love story was bigger than just them. It was about healing old wounds, bridging divides, and proving that love, given a second chance, could triumph over prejudice and fear. Martha would recover, and her revelation would become the foundation for a new chapter in both families' lives. The gardens of the Whitmore estate would continue to bloom, tended by David's skilled hands, now carrying the weight of history and hope for the future.